It's kinda crazy to me that to this day, we've never seen a really good Lex Luthor adaptation in a live-action Superman movie. We have seen great adaptations of Luthor in other forms of media throughout the years, but even though there's been multiple live-action Superman films, every time they've used Lex Luthor as a villain, they always seem to miss the mark. Gene Hackman and Kevin Spacey's interpretations of the character were entertaining at times, but they still felt shallow and overall one-dimensional. But many would argue that the latest live-action version of Luthor that we saw in 2016's Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice felt like it completely missed the mark. From how a good Lex Luthor adaptation should be handled, it misrepresented his characterization and failed to thoughtfully convey in a believable way Luthor's motivation for hating Superman. A lot of people would say that the DCEU version of Lex Luthor played by Jesse Eisenberg mostly failed because it deviated way too much from how the character is usually depicted in the source material, since for this version of him, they chose to lean into a more modern take, envisioning him as a young tech capitalist similar to Mark Zuckerberg, rather than the usual influential businessman take that we've grown accustomed to through the years in the comics and multiple animated shows and movies. Some feel that this concept for a younger Luthor inherently doesn't work for him. However, very recently, My Adventures with Superman has proven to us that you can actually adapt Lex Luthor as a younger modern tech entrepreneur with a full head of hair and still make it work, since, in my opinion, they have done a fantastic job in carefully adapting Luthor in a planned and well thought out way, since in the show's second season that recently started releasing, they revealed that the young, unassuming assistant of Professor Ivo from season 1, who was named Alex, was actually Lex Luthor, and proving that they really took the time and care to slowly adapt Superman's most important enemy in a meaningful way that respects the character. So it's not that a younger, more modern version of Luthor can't work. The problem is that the execution of this interpretation from Batman v Superman failed because it misunderstands the themes and motivations of Luthor from the source material. His awkward mannerisms, frenetic and cartoonishly over-the-top way of speaking also obviously didn't help, but these are all superficial problems with this version of Luthor. A bigger problem is that the character is constantly trying to seem confident and powerful in the eyes of other characters in the movie, but it really feels like false confidence. His position of power felt unearned because the audience never saw him accomplish his feats. But the biggest problem with the DCEU's Lex Luthor, and why I feel like this version failed as an adaptation, is because his motivation for hating Superman was underdeveloped, misguided, and in reality is truly a sign that Zack Snyder fundamentally misunderstands Superman comics, its themes, and its characters. The reason why Lex Luthor truly hates Superman and why he's so compelling as a villain is that, in Luthor's mind, he's Superman. He honestly sees himself as the embodiment of a human being in his absolute mental peak, who shows all that humanity can accomplish. He's an extreme idealist that sincerely believes in humanity's infinite potential, but when he sees Superman, he sees an alien that has godlike powers beyond humanity's reach, powers he didn't have to sacrifice and work hard to achieve, like us mortal human beings have to. That's why Luthor finds Superman's mere existence insulting to him on a fundamental level, because it undermines everything Luthor had to do to get where he is, and the appearance of Superman and powered beings like him puts humanity's agency and liberty in danger, because at any moment, the planet could be conquered and ruled by an alien being that isn't one of us. This is why Luthor is such a compelling villain, because while he may be a cold, calculated, murderous criminal, his appreciation and respect for humanity is truly sincere. One of my favorite moments from Luthor is an excellent short sequence in the 2005 miniseries Lex Luthor Man of Steel, written by Brian Azzarello and illustrated by Lee Bermejo, which is fantastic by the way. And there's a sequence in the comic where Luthor is in his office and briefly starts talking and fraternizing with the janitor that's cleaning up the room. The janitor respectfully calls him Mr. Luthor, but Luthor insists that he calls him Lex. They continue having a friendly conversation, where Luthor is genuinely interested in the man in his life. He even manages to get the janitor's son into a very prestigious school, all because he saw that the man was struggling. Lex sincerely wanted to help him out. This is a fantastic moment, but there's even more examples of Luthor being kind. After an earthquake hit Gotham City and almost destroyed it, Lex Luthor helped to rebuild it completely. When he got elected as president, he was depicted inside DC's world as a competent leader. until he couldn't resist and tried to kill Superman, screwing everything he accomplished, but still. In the classic All-Star Superman, there's also a scene where Luthor and Clark Kent are talking, and Luthor admits to Clark that he honestly respects him as a person, specifically because he's everything Superman isn't. In his eyes, Clark Kent's bumbling, awkward, and insecure personality makes him flawed, and by extension, these traits are a true sign of his humanity, a humanity that Superman lacks, according to him. And this is beautifully ironic, because Lex can't realize that Clark is Superman, and that while he might be viewed as being godlike, he is still flawed. He intentionally plays up his awkward personality while he's Clark Kent in public to make people less suspicious, but he still has insecurities, he still has worries and flaws like any other person, because in reality, Superman is human. But Luthor can't see that because he's blinded by hate and fixed on his idealistic perspective. He can't recognize Superman's humanity, even though he says that he loves humans. But the irony in his flawed perspective is that even though he claims to love human beings, he still has no problem in killing hundreds of innocent men, women, and children in order to get what he wants. In reality, Luthor loves humanity as a concept rather than loving humans on an individual level. He wants to control humanity and the entire planet. He's egotistical, petty, a narcissist, and a hypocrite. It's often been said that if it wasn't for Superman distracting him, Lex Luthor could use his abilities to save the world, but in reality, Luthor could only save the world if he didn't have such evil tendencies, like in some alternate universes where he's sincerely good. But most times, Superman is the only thing standing in between Luthor and him becoming a dictator. Luthor uses his idealistic opposition to Superman as an excuse to do all of his hateful crimes. This is how Lex Luthor's motivation is usually explained in a lot of the character's greatest stories. However, the DCEU Luthor's motivation for hating Superman is because he was abused by his father as a young child and nobody saved him. The movie makes an analogy between Luthor's hatred for his abusive father with his hatred for Superman. Since Luthor grew up powerless, being abused by his own father, he ended up developing a resentment towards authority figures, like gods for example. And since Superman is also godlike, he sees in him everything that has hurt him in his life and hates him for it. That mixed in with some basic xenophobia because he's an alien. But the movie really beats you over the head with the fact that this version of Luthor hates Superman because of his trauma caused by his abusive father. Almost every single time that this Luthor has some dialogue scenes in the movie, he starts talking about his father.
My dad always said that Kentucky Mash was the secret to health. This was his room.
Even the first time we get introduced to him, he's talking about his dad.
And on the marquee. No, don't believe it. My father named the company after himself. He was the Lex in front of the corp. How you doing?
Even when he meets Superman for the first time face to face, right away he starts talking about his dad.
No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from daddy's fist and abominations.
To have Luthor's main motivation for hating Superman be caused by his trauma stemming from his father's abuse isn't really a bad idea. It's been a part of Luthor's backstory in the comics for years now, and I personally do like it, since giving Lex a troubled childhood gives depth to his character. But in Batman v Superman, the execution of this was off in my opinion, and I say this as someone who also had a problematic childhood, in large part because I also grew up with an abusive father. I don't want to get too personal, but I do completely understand how childhood trauma can have lifelong psychological effects on people. But that doesn't mean that people go around talking about their trauma all the time, even in front of complete strangers like in BVS. This would be as if every time that Batman appears, he would be constantly talking about his parents every time he has dialogue. It's ridiculous, and it feels like a reductive way of depicting someone with these kinds of issues. But beyond that, it simply doesn't feel to be in Luthor's character to constantly be talking about the life and accomplishments of another man, even if that man is his own father. Lex Luthor is meant to be confident. He's meant to be someone charming with people. Again, in Luthor's mind, he thinks of himself as the real Superman. Tell me, do you honestly think that this guy thinks that he's Superman? It does feel like he's arrogant and has some sense of superiority, but he also reeks of insecurity and feelings of inadequacy. Another reason why many people say that they dislike the Luthor from BVS is because that version of the character was a product of old money. The character's full name in the movie was actually Alexander Luthor Jr. He was basically a nepo baby, given that the character inherited his company from his father, so even though he may act confident in the movie, it feels like his position of power is unearned. and it's implied throughout the movie, and later hinted at by Zack Snyder himself, that Lex Luthor Jr. murdered his father in order to take over his company, and in supplementary material for the movie, it's described how he transformed LexCorp from a struggling petrochemical and heavy machinery company into one of the most successful technology giants in the world, greatly expanding the wealth that he inherited from his father. And all of this sounds like it would have been a good idea. This could have made the DCEU Luthor Jr. a better character, you know, if they had actually shown it, or at least some of it, in the movie. There's a storytelling rule called show, don't tell, that Batman v Superman completely disregarded and didn't respect at all. In any story, in order for the audience to truly find it engaging, they should always experience the story, character growth, and relevant events by actually showing these developments, rather than simply telling or describing what has happened with exposition. It's simply lazy writing to summarize what your character has done, rather than actually showing it to the audience, and not put in the time and effort to really give depth to them. So instead of telling the audience why they should respect or care about this version of Luthor, they could have actually shown us how he killed his father, even in an abridged form, since it would have given Luthor's sense of entitlement and confidence at least some sense of credibility. It would have felt like he actually earned the company and his own reputation as one of the smartest men on Earth, rather than simply inheriting the company and hard work of his father. BVS was already an incredibly bloated movie, with forced setups for a cinematic universe that ended up dying before it even started. It's one of the reasons why it's really not that good of a movie in my opinion. But one way the movie could have been better is if they had actually bothered to flesh out and give depth to its main villain. I mean, they had a flashback scene for Batman's origin. They could have easily done a brief flashback for Luthor Jr.'s origin, and it could have been great, because they could have done a juxtaposition between how Batman's parents were randomly killed in front of him, and how Luthor Jr. purposefully killed his own father in order to usurp into control of his company. That would have been a way better use of the movie's time than shoving in 5 god-awful, clunky, and awkward cameos. This background for the character greatly contrasts with the Lex Luthor in My Adventures with Superman, because in that show, his rise to power actually felt earned. They cared enough to actually show him start at the bottom as Ivo's lab assistant, being constantly disrespected and mistreated by him, to ending up earning the respect of Amanda Waller and the US government by literally walking all over Ivo after deactivating his power suit that Luthor himself actually created, only to show how dominant he has become. That is truly showing rather than telling the audience about a character's growth. That is real character development that the audience can actually see and appreciate. By having Luthor be a self-made man that didn't inherit his wealth, makes us understand why he would despise someone like Superman who was born with his powers and didn't have to work hard to earn them. And it makes us believe why someone like Luthor would honestly think that he's superior to a being like Superman, since he can conceptualize and create technology that can recreate his powers. Seeing him confront Superman in front of dozens of people and being able to manipulate them into fearing Superman truly shows that he fully understands how he can stand against and hurt a being that's physically much stronger than him. The confidence of this version of Luthor is believable, but the DCEU's Luthor Jr. really doesn't convey any kind of confidence. Even though one of My Adventures with Superman's most common criticisms has been that some of its villains feel underdeveloped and bad adaptations of how they could have been portrayed, I honestly think that this version of Lex Luthor is pretty good so far, because much like their reinvention of General Lane, who isn't really an evil villain, but was used as the main antagonist for Season 2, these reinventions actually feels like their inclusion was well thought out and advanced. And they put in the time to show the character's evolution throughout the show, which makes the audience understand their motivations as antagonists. And they've done a great job at depicting Luthor both as a great scientific mind that can create really powerful technology, and also as a great entrepreneur and businessman, since he started from the very bottom as an assistant at Amazo, only to create his own LexCorp, working alongside the US government and Waller. Also, just to clarify, in the comics, Luthor isn't always a self-made man, but this background has been common for the character ever since DC's continuity was rebooted, post-Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985. It was after this that Luthor was reimagined from his traditional mad scientist characterization into a more businessman Donald Trump type character who grew up in the suicide slums, which is the poorest area of Metropolis. And it was after this change that this background started being a part of Luthor's character, and honestly I think it's the best backstory for him that completely complements his motivation for hating Superman, and the best stories from the comics that have used Luthor in modern times tend to include this aspect of him as well. However, it would be too simplistic and reductive to claim that the DCEU Luthor Jr. was a bad adaptation simply because he was a nepo baby and came from old money, since Smallville already showed us that a Lex Luthor that was born into wealth and that's a product of nepotism can actually still be a compelling character and a solid adaptation of Luthor that stays true to his character while still being a fresh new take, since throughout his story on the show, we actually saw him change in character from a well-intentioned but morally ambiguous young man who was abused by his father into becoming a true master manipulator and heartless killer that ended up murdering his father and taking over his power, just like the backstory for the DCU Luthor is supposed to go, but with the very small detail that Smallville actually bothered to show us this character growth, rather than talking about it or alluding to it. This is why it should be clear that the DCEU Lex Luthor didn't fail because making a young Zuckerberg-esque tech millionaire reinvention of Luthor doesn't work, since My Adventures with Superman showed us that that version of the character can work if it's well thought out. And he also didn't fail because making a nepo baby old money Luthor is an inherently bad idea, since Smallville also showed us that a Luthor who was born into wealth can also totally work. What failed in the DCEU's Luthor Jr.'s case was that the execution of these ideas didn't land because Zack Snyder and the movie's writers had a fundamental misunderstanding of the comics and Lex Luthor's character. And because of this, Luthor's motivation for hating Superman was underdeveloped and didn't feel true to Luthor's character. I do honestly believe that Zack Snyder really does love comic books and these characters. It's just that it's obvious that he only loves his interpretation of these comics, which usually is completely off from the real messages and themes that the stories were depicting. For example, Watchmen in the comics is a deconstruction and critique of why superheroes as a concept in a more realistic world wouldn't work due to the corrupt nature of human beings and the overwhelming political forces in our world. The action in the comic was deliberately shown as something horrific, messy, and truly violent, rather than a spectacle or being cool, exactly to complement this theme of the story. But Zack Snyder in his adaptation chose to completely disregard the story's themes, and he actually glorified violence. The characters literally fight as if they have superpowers, even though they're meant to be normal, regular people. And look, I honestly do like Zack Snyder's Watchmen. I think it's mostly a pretty good movie. It's just not a good adaptation, and with BVS is much the same. The movie takes inspiration from The Dark Knight Returns, but in the comic itself, even though Batman literally says that guns are the weapons of cowards, since it's a crucial aspect of the character's background and psychology, Zack Snyder, again, still chose to completely ignore that part of the comic he supposedly loves so much, just to have Batman with a machine gun shooting like crazy, just because he feels like he knows these comics and characters better than literal decades worth of stories from writers who actually love and respect these mythologies. This is also why I'm genuinely excited for James Gunn's Superman, since, unlike Snyder, he honestly feels like a real comic book fan and has proven to be one with his films. Nicholas Hoult is also a great actor. I loved him in X-Men First Class, and especially in Mad Max Fury Road. I'm really excited to see what he'll do with the character, and I hope we can finally get to see a truly complete adaptation of Lex Luthor in a live-action Superman movie that pays respect to the character's legacy. He has amazing stories where they could pull inspiration from, like All-Star Superman, which Gunn has already said will be an inspiration for the movie. Seeing Luthor get Superman's powers would be insane, or seeing him in his power suit, or working alongside Brainiac. There's a lot of possibilities, and I'm just really excited to see what they do with Luthor in the movies. And I'm also really excited to see how they'll continue developing Lex Luthor's character in My Adventures with Superman. I'm really enjoying Season 2 so far, and I'm planning on making a full review of Season 2 once it's over, just like I did for Season 1 last year. But as of right now, I'm just really enjoying these new episodes. So yeah, these are all my Lex Luthor thoughts I've been having lately. And I wanted to thank Bat Spectre for his video on why Owlman works and The Batman Who Laughs doesn't, and also Cinecide for his video on why BoJack Horseman works and 13 Reasons Why doesn't. They are both fantastic videos that I highly recommend, and they gave me the inspiration to make this video, comparing and contrasting two very similar, yet different versions of the same character. But with all that being said, what do you think? Have you liked Season 2 so far? Do you also think that the My Adventures with Superman version of Lex Luthor is better than the DCEU's? And are you excited to see Nicholas Hoult play Lex Luthor? Please, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.